What this shows, what this meeting between the Russians and the Africans show, however, is the global dimensions of the crisis in Ukraine. And I say that because not only is the crisis in Ukraine now causing every aspect of global affairs to rearrange itself around it, but it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the United States, the country which is to some extent, to a great extent, at the very center of this crisis, along with Ukraine and Russia, is now in serious danger of losing the initiative and having moves actually forced upon it. Let's start with a brief overview of the military situation. Now, there's been more reports coming out of the battlefronts in Ukraine. It seems that Severodonetsk is now under Russian control, apart from a number of stragglers who are still holding out in a few apartment buildings in Severodonetsk, and around 800 people, according to the governor of Lugansk region. Note the use of the word people, who are holding out in the Azot chemical factory, a major industrial facility, by the way, one of Ukraine's most important industrial plants, which is located on the outskirts of the city. Azot does not, it seems, have the network of underground installations that the Azovstal steelworks did, or at least not to anything like the same degree. And the Ukrainian troops who've retreated to the Azot steelworks do not share the motivations and the disciplines of the Azov regiment that was located at the Azovstal steelworks. And of course, they've not had the time to fortify the Azot chemical factory to anything like the degree that the Azovstal steelworks had been fortified, so that it had become a virtual fortress. So it's plausible that the Ukrainian troops at the Azot chemical factory will either have to give up and surrender, or perhaps face the depressing consequences of being killed or wounded in action before very long. And that will leave Severodonetsk under Russian control fully. Now, this is a major psychological blow, as much as any other blow, to Ukraine, because in the run-up to the Battle of Severodonetsk, which, note, seems to have only lasted a few days in comparison to the weeks that it took the Russians to clear Mariupol, in the run-up to the Battle of Severodonetsk, the Ukrainians had discussed at length, spoken at great lengths about how the city, Severodonetsk, had been made a virtual fortress, and how it would be impossible for the Russians to capture Severodonetsk, which is on low ground, ahead of capturing the neighboring town of Lysychansk, which is rather smaller, but which is on high ground, and from which Ukrainian artillery supposedly would be able to prevent Russian troops from storming Severodonetsk. Well, none of that has proved to be true, and you can see some attempts by the Ukrainian officials to try to explain this away. There's been some really rather strange and I find rather sad talk that the Ukrainians have actually in some way lured the Russians into a trap in Severodonetsk, and that the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is coming, is going to somehow reverse the situation in this part of the battlefield. I have to say, I don't think anybody who has been following these developments with any understanding of military affairs, I don't pretend I have much understanding of military affairs, but to the extent I do, I'm able to follow people who I trust and who appear to me do have that understanding. I don't think anybody with a proper understanding of military affairs takes this Ukrainian claim that the Russians have been lured into a trap in Severodonetsk at all seriously. And I have to say also that with the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk now looks increasingly vulnerable. And there were reports yesterday, which I can't confirm, but they do seem to come from reliable sources, that the Russians have captured a settlement called Pilipchenko, which is on the road to the town of Bakhmut, or Artomysk, as it's sometimes called, which appears to be the major military base, rear base, from which the Ukrainians have been struggling, trying to keep their forces in Lysychansk and Severodonetsk supplied. If Bakhmut is invested, if it's surrounded by the Russians, if it's captured, then it seems to me that the fate of the Ukrainian forces in Lysychansk is sealed. So it doesn't look like the situation there is turning out well for Ukraine. Meanwhile, it also seems that elsewhere in the battlefield in Donbass, things are also not going particularly well for Ukraine. It now appears that Russian forces advancing from the east are now within about 14 kilometers of Slavyansk, well within artillery range of the city. And it seems that civilians are now trying to evacuate from Slavyansk. Slavyansk is the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where a significant part of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is located. And I understand, by the way, that the Ukrainian headquarters, the Ukrainian army's headquarters for the Ukrainian army group located in Donbass is actually situated in Kramatorsk. So if Slavyansk, Kramatorsk fall, if the Ukrainian troops in these two places are surrounded and forced to surrender, or if the military group there is destroyed, well, then in that case, it seems to me that one can say definitely that the Battle of Donbass will be in its very end point, and that the Russians will have won. So, not good news for Ukraine in Donbass. And it's looking increasingly bleak for Ukraine in Kharkiv. Now, I return perhaps tediously to the question of the Kharkiv counteroffensive that Ukraine launched a few weeks ago. It was much talked about in the Western media. It was presented as a great victory by Ukraine, comparable to the victory Ukraine allegedly won in the Battle of Kiev. And I read articles about how Ukraine had won the Battle of Kharkiv. Well, the Russians have now been pushing the Ukrainians all the way back, and it seems that the major villages that the Ukrainians had captured closer to the Russian border have now all been recaptured by the Russians. But perhaps more ominously for the Ukrainians, the Russian troops now seem to be methodically advancing on and recapturing some of those villages and settlements close to Kharkiv itself. You might almost call them outlying suburbs of Kharkiv, which the Russians had occupied through March and April and early May, and which were from whence one could say that Kharkiv itself was under threat of Russian attack and of being placed under siege. So in effect, that Ukrainian counteroffensive has not only failed in its objective of pushing the Russians back beyond the Russian border, it looks as if it's not only totally reversed, but totally reversed in a catastrophic way. And there are growing reports that the Ukrainians actually invested more in terms of men and supplies in this counteroffensive than I had initially imagined. I'd assumed that the forces involved on both sides in this part of the front were fairly small. It seems this was true on the Russian side. It seems it was not so true on the Ukrainian side, and that these reverses have this pushback of the Russians back to the suburbs of Kharkiv has resulted in Ukraine suffering substantial losses in the area around Kharkiv. If all this is correct, then, by the way, what has happened around Kharkiv highlights again the contrast between the way that the Russians conduct their war, with war conducted there by professionals, by people who are not afraid to order tactical withdrawals to more defendable positions to save their troops and their supplies so that they can then be redeployed and resupplied and put in a position where they can launch a counteroffensive, with the, I have to say this, much more amateur way in which Ukraine conducts its war, where there is consistent refusal on the part of the Ukrainian leadership to countenance withdrawals from any inch of territory, with the result that troops get just defeated and destroyed and killed and wounded in very large numbers, and large amounts of material get lost as well. So we see a professional army, professionally led by the Russians. They withdrew from Kharkiv ahead of a superior Ukrainian force. They then bided their time, waited for the Ukrainians to run out of supplies, counterattacked, pushed them all the way back to Kharkiv, in effect negating the effect of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and the contrast with the way in which the Ukrainians have thrown away the lives of more and more of their men and thrown away large amounts of material in the Battle of Donbass. Now, there's been all kinds of confusing reports about a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region. I'm not able to verify exactly what's happening. Reports coming out of that part of the front are contradictory and confusing. I'm not going to discuss what's happening there. Safe to say that it seems to me that, again, the Ukrainians are not making much progress. And once more, I would say that it seems to me that even if they do make progress, if they do make some gains, they're likely to prove every bit as ephemeral as the gains they made in Kharkiv region, northeast of Kharkiv, have turned out to be. So there we are, Ukraine being ground down, losing in Donbass, and a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region that has comprehensively miscarried. And now we come to the United States and what it's doing, because there's been this very strange seesaw about the delivery of the HIMARS systems, why the United States has scaled down the number of HIMARS systems it's providing, why it refused to provide the Ukrainians with the long-range ATACMS systems. And we've now had some clarity about this, because apparently there's an enormous debate going on within the administration about and the US government about the enormous dangers of the war becoming expanding and involving other countries. So the US is nervous about supplying Ukraine with certain types of long-range weapon systems, which might lead Ukraine to carry out strikes into Russia, because they're terrified, apparently, that would cause the Russians to retaliate and might risk the war expanding into countries, NATO states, in which case the United States would be under enormous pressure to intervene to defend those states itself, and that might cause it to enter into a direct military confrontation with Russia. And I suspect that this explains why certain things that we were talking about a few weeks ago, both on this channel and on other channels, on the Duran, and which was widely discussed in alternative media, the expansion of the war into Moldova, into Transnistria, the Polish intervention in Western Ukraine that was much debated. I have to say, we don't know for a fact that that was ever planned. But anyway, I am going to make a guess that the reason none of those things have happened is that the US government took a clear-cut decision that it was not going to allow them to happen, that it warned Kiev and Warsaw and possibly Chisinau and Bucharest and other capitals that it did not want the war to expand beyond Ukraine, because it did not want to be put in a position, the United States did not want to be put in a position where it might have to rescue its East European allies from a military debacle of a kind that the Russians might inflict, and that it did not want a situation in which it went head to head with the Russians. And what we've learned, and this has been confirmed to some extent by the White House, is that there's even been a great deal of discussion and talk within the United States, within the government of the United States, about how to respond, how the US would respond if the Russians used tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine and carried out demonstrations of the use of tactical nuclear weapons, presumably exploded some nuclear device as a kind of warning signal. And it seems that the United States, the US government, has not been able to come up with any clear ideas about what it would do. And by the way, going back to President Biden's op-ed, President Biden, the op-ed that was published recently in the New York Times, President Biden said that there would be severe consequences for Russia if anything like that happened. But of course, he gave no indication of what those severe consequences would be, and it's not obvious what they could be. The one thing that the United States doesn't want, thank goodness, is a nuclear exchange with the Russians, one which would escalate into World War III. And it seems that there is a consensus within the United States government that this must not happen. And the result is that the United States is now finding itself in a position where it's making its decisions with respect to Ukraine in order to prevent that from happening. And what that shows to my mind is the extent to which a narrative, an information war exercise can spiral out of control and can lead to consequences which are not only unexpected but are actually damaging to the people who initially promoted them. Because as I discussed in a program I did exclusively for locals some time ago, the Russians have never in fact threatened to use nuclear weapons during the Ukraine war. They've given certain warnings, and you can interpret those warnings in all sorts of ways. But to me, all of those appear to be warnings that the Russians would use nuclear weapons, but only if nuclear weapons were used against them. In other words, all these claims that the Russians have been saber-rattling with nuclear weapons, that Putin himself has been saber-rattling with nuclear weapons, were based on a misreading or a misconstruction of comments that the Russians had made. Maybe that was a willful misreading or misconstruction. Maybe it was one that was driven by, well, frankly, paranoid thinking. But regardless, the fact is, I don't see any evidence that the Russians have ever contemplated solving any conventional war problems in Ukraine by using nuclear weapons. In fact, they have consistently ruled that option out. But the very fact that this narrative of the Russians threatening or being prepared to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in that way, the very fact that that narrative has circulated has had an effect where it's distorted US policy, because the US is now worried about that possibility. It's certainly very worried that if the Poles get themselves into trouble in Ukraine and the Russians counterattack, and if some of those counterstrikes that the Russians launch start affecting Polish territory, well, at that point, the United States is going to be in an incredibly difficult position. Does it come to Poland's rescue under Article 5, under whatever interpretation you want to impose on Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, as a NATO ally, one NATO ally, rescuing another? Or does it abandon Poland to its fate, in which case the risk is that the credibility of NATO collapses? In the former case, it risks a possible nuclear exchange with Russia, a nuclear superpower. In the case of the second, it runs the risk of humiliation and perhaps the fatal collapse in NATO's credibility. So the result is that the United States is now desperate to try to contain the war. So this is why we have this extraordinary game of push-pull in terms of weapons supplies. So much talk about supplying HIMARS systems. The Ukrainians were ceaselessly lobbying for these long-range heavy weapons that would supposedly change the course of the battle. And we see a supply of a few, 4, perhaps 12 altogether, if the British and the Germans chip in, which isn't, by the way, guaranteed. But the missiles supplied are of restricted range, which provides Ukraine with no more than a capability it previously already had. And there have also been promises made, or promises rather extracted from Ukraine, that these weapon systems will not be used to attack Russian territory. And we also see the same confusion about the supply of armed drones to Ukraine. The Ukrainians are clearly unhappy with our Turkish Bayraktar drones. They've proved those drones, much talked about previous to the war. They were supposed to be a tremendous game changer in the war. There were articles, I can remember reading them in some sections of the US media in the run-up, not just to the war, but to the military crisis that happened in eastern Ukraine in the spring of 2021, when the Ukraine deployed large numbers of troops to the Donbass front, and the Russians responded by their own military build-up there. Anyway, there'd been articles in the American media at that time, the neocon think tank media, I should say, whereby Ukraine, with its Bayraktar drones, would be able to launch a successful strike against the Donbass militia and capture the Donbass. And that seems to have distorted strategic thinking. Well, the Bayraktar drones have not proved especially effective. So now the Ukrainians are asking for more advanced drones from the United States. So does the United States supply them or not? Well, eventually, after much discussion, they are going to supply Grey Eagle drones. But of course, they're trying to distance themselves from this. Ukraine isn't going to simply be supplied by these drones, it must buy them. So the Ukrainians are actually going to pay for these drones. Except, of course, that in reality, Ukraine will be paying for these drones with the money that the United States is providing. And of course, these drones actually do have the range to launch attacks on targets in Russia, though the chances, in my opinion, of them successfully doing so against the extremely sophisticated Russian air defense system are probably not great. And In addition, so far, the US is only providing 4 of these things. So we see how the US, on the one hand, it can't allow Ukraine to lose, because if Ukraine loses, it's a debacle for the United States, the Biden administration. Its credibility would be sunk under the waterline, and there would be major political consequences for the administration in the United States if that were to happen. But on the other hand, it can't escalate too far, because if it does, it risks enlarging the war in a way that could cause a direct confrontation with the Russians. So what does it do? It supplies Ukraine with dribs of drabs of weapons. It's not being able to make up its mind exactly what it's going to do, and the amounts of weapons it does supply are obviously not going to change the situation on the battlefields. So the US, it seems to me, is losing the strategic initiative in terms of the conduct of the actual war. It wants to supply enough weapon systems to Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from being defeated, from losing, but it can't supply too many, because if it does, if Ukraine uses these weapon systems to attack Russia, well, that risks enlarging the war and bringing the United States at serious risk of direct confrontation with Russia. Again, this was never thought through properly. Barack Obama, back in 2016, warned against the United States becoming involved in Ukraine, where the Russians have, as he put it, escalatory dominance. Subsequent administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, ignored that warning, and the Biden administration is now paying the price. Let's now turn to this other aspect, which is the African Union meetings with the Russians, and what that's all about, and why that also shows that the United States is at risk of losing the initiative on other fronts. The African states buy significant amounts of food from Russia, and they also buy fertilizer, and they are facing food shortages, and this could create a potential crisis for them. And they've already complained to the European Union that the decision of the European Union to disconnect certain Russian banks from SWIFT was done without any consultation with the African states, and that is complicating the Africans' ability to pay the Russians for the wheat and grain and fertilizer that they need. So, what do the African states do? Well, the European Union isn't going to walk back its sanctions, nor of course is the United States. The European Union is not in a position to provide the Africans either with food or indeed energy, oil and gas and all that, oil certainly, and nor are they of course in a position to provide the Africans with chemical fertilizer or all of those things. So that is why the president of Senegal is now going to Russia, and why we now have a summit meeting between the Russians and the African states under discussion. And who knows how all of this is going to turn out, but I suspect that the Russians and the Africans are going to negotiate some mechanism for the Russians to send oil and food to Africa in return for some kind of payment mechanism, but it'll be a payment mechanism that will be negotiated directly between the Russians and the Africans. It may require use of the Russian interbank messaging system, which is operating in Russia in replacement of SWIFT. And I think everybody, by the way, in the West has been astonished at how smoothly this came into operation when Russian banks were disconnected from SWIFT. So it may be that we're going to start to see that system extended to African states, though that will take time to do. But I suspect also we're probably going to see something rather similar to the gas for rubles deal, but this time extended to Africa. African states do not have rubles in any quantity that they can use to buy grain and food from the Russians. So I suspect what's going to happen is that the Russians will say, well, that's fine, open corresponding accounts with Russian banks, pay into those accounts dollars to buy your grain, and we will convert those dollars into rubles, and that will enable you to buy grain and food in Russia, and oil probably, and chemical fertilizer, and all of those things. And of course, it's one step, another big step, towards the internationalization of the ruble and to the setting up of alternative trade and currency systems outside the control of the Western powers. Now, I think that the Africans have no real choice but to do this. I think they will come under a lot of pressure from the Western powers not to go along. But ultimately, whatever pressure the Africans come under, they need oil and they need food. And it's likely before long that Arab states, which also import wheat from Russia, will go along with these mechanisms also. Zoltan Pojdar, a US analyst, or maybe he's not from the US, but anyway, a financial affairs analyst, has been discussing recently about how we're moving towards a new system of reserve currencies based on commodities. Well, what we're talking about, these arrangements, are not an alternative reserve currency system. The ruble is nowhere near close to becoming a reserve currency. But it is taking steps towards becoming an internationally traded currency, which is, of course, a possible step in that direction. Was that what the United States wanted when it started this sanctions war, this economic war of attrition against the Russians? I don't think so. I can't imagine that anybody in Washington imagined it. But there we are. That's where we're going. So, as I said, US is starting to see that this thing is getting out of its control. We will see what more it can do and how it responds to the challenges that lie ahead.